Perfect. Thank you. Thank you all for joining. Sorry we're getting started a little bit later than expected here. As was mentioned, Travis Hunter, I direct the MIT Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program. We're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about um, our view on what we call innovation ecosystems and how that those can be a key driver for economic and social prosperity in particular regions around the world. Let's check and see if this clicker works. Yep, there we go. Oh, get ahead of myself. Um, so, how many of you have been to MIT or Cambridge, Massachusetts? All right, we've got quite a few. Fantastic. So, this is a picture of Kendall Square back in the 1980s, and this is quite desolate, if you might say. This is actually a particular location that the city of Boston would pay the city of Cambridge to dump the snow in the winter. So you can imagine it's not very high value land if that's where the snow gets dumped. It was also not a very good area back then. It was kind of a dangerous, sketchy area. You didn't want to walk around there at night. And you fast forward to today, and it looks remarkably different, right? And you'll see this in other places too. You see this in Silicon Valley, etc. And so the question is, how does that transformation in a relatively short period of time happen? And that is kind of the premise question behind innovation ecosystems and how they can kind of transform the landscape of a particular region. And so there's lots of types of businesses that come out of any particular region. You have lots of SMEs. You have scalable companies like these IDEs. Maybe these are some software companies that you've recognized. These actually have come out of that Boston Cambridge ecosystem. And so our question is like, how do these companies evolve and develop in particular regions? Um, and not only are they kind of SaaS companies as we see in Silicon Valley, but they're also focused on other types of industries and much harder in deep tech, as we're going to talk about in a few minutes, much harder problems to solve, whether it be Commonwealth fusion systems, trying to create fusion energy for the world, PillPack, which sold to Amazon, which delivers pills to your doorstep. BioBot, which is analyzing sewage water to understand the makeup of diseases in a particular region. HubSpot, which is a large marketing company that's spun out at MIT. And Moderna, which many of you may recognize from the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, far too often, we see regions try and fail to create their own innovation ecosystem. We've seen this in Silicon Prairie, Silicon Savannah, Silicon anything. You've seen this around the world. And so, why do some regions fail at this and some succeed? That's another good question. This is an example of Tony Hsieh. He was a internet SaaS founder. He started a company called Zappos. And he took his wealth to Las Vegas and said, I am going to create Las Vegas as a new innovation ecosystem from scratch. I'm going to invest all my money in this, try to bring talent, bring all the resources, and make this a new startup hub. And ultimately, it did not work. Las Vegas does not look like Silicon Valley these days. And so, we're trying to figure out why some of these projects succeed and why some don't. And so, how do we take and accelerate and engage what we call innovation driven entrepreneurial ecosystems? And that's where this program called MIT REAP comes in. These are our core faculty. We're actually joined by one of them, Lars Furlund. And each of them has a specialty area from economics to investing, diplomatic skills, ideas on platform strategy, and so forth that we're bringing together to kind of showcase how do you actually manipulate these particular innovation ecosystems. We're also supported by an amazing staff team, including my team and our leader, David Capitalupo. And over the past 13 years, we've been able to work with over 90 different parts of the world on this exact topic. How do you actually transform an innovation ecosystem? So our theory of change begins with this. So we have these three different layers: systems, strategy, and stakeholders. We think that these are very interlinked areas. Engaging with stakeholders that can actually make a change in a particular region, and then viewing that region is as a systems dynamic problem, something that you can actually have influence on and leverage, and then developing a strategy to actually achieve that. And so when we think, sorry, push the button. Test. When we think about entrepreneurship, we think about the single necessary sufficient condition for an innovation ecosystem is to have an entrepreneur. But nobody's really in charge of entrepreneurship. Many people from government think that they are the ones responsible to create programs and initiatives to try to spur in entrepreneurship. But really, that can only help. It's not really the driver of entrepreneurship. And so we really feel that each one of these key stakeholders needs to be involved for an innovation ecosystem to thrive, but not just be involved, kind of understand what the vision and long-term impact of the region will be and their role in it, because these organizations have very different objectives, right? But if you think about what their role is and how they can work together towards a common vision, that's what we would like to try to get to. We had a team come through the program from Singapore a number of years ago, and this is actually the government accelerator, and it looks like it's missing something, if am I right? Um, One of the problems was that when the government stood up in this accelerator, they thought people will just come, right? And that happens all over the world, and we see that fail time and time again. And then just down the street, we have the VC sponsored accelerator that is full of people and super lively. We actually have one of our faculty members, Bill Olet, here visiting too. And just that juxtaposition of different stakeholders putting forward the effort to try to facilitate entrepreneurial connections between these founders is really, really interesting to understand. And trying to figure out which stakeholder needs to take the lead and which particular part of the ecosystem is really important. One other example is from our team from Central Denmark. We had a team from there that Lars actually was a part of before he joined our faculty team. And they were focused on trying to figure out how to engage university students as well as the community in a central location. And they created this thing called the Kitchen, which is really open for all. And it's an innovation center for the community, researchers, professors, staff, et cetera, to be able to use. And so when we think about this theory of change, we think about, okay, how do you analyze a system? How do you think about what the system dynamics issues are in a particular region? And I'm going to turn to Lars in just a couple of minutes here.
Okay.
We're going to start off with this key concept about SMEs versus IDEs. We think that there's actually a very wide spectrum between SMEs and IDEs in a particular region. And actually, the more IDEs that you have in a particular region, we see that more SMEs grow from that model. So you end up seeing that those IDEs are actually, creating these SMEs in a way, because these other smaller medium enterprises are being developed to support employees and services that are actually developed by the IDEs. And so where do IDEs come from? This is where I'm going to turn over to Lars to talk a little bit more about the model.
Right. I probably need this.
Oh, about the Taylor Swift mic?
Okay. I'll take the Taylor Swift mic. All right. Thank you, Travis. So basically, I guess to move forward, I do this. Right. So basically, IDEs or innovation-driven enterprises are, we're going to talk about a little bit about deep tech as well, but fundamentally, I think the general conception of this is to say that an enormous amount of companies come from a strong knowledge base. That knowledge base can be often built on research. Research that turns into inventions. Those inventions can be patented. Some of those patents then actually go to the market. One of the key problems of many innovation ecosystems, I actually also believe that's one of the key challenges of the ecosystem, at least in Rio de Janeiro, maybe in Brazil, but there you need to teach me, is that there is still not enough companies that are built on knowledge that comes from the university, that basically is translated into startups that start competing with your large corporations at the end of the day. I sometimes say a little bit about, I know this, I said this to the Rio team when they was going through the program. I said, one of your success criteria, and two of the team members was, and still is, from Petrobras. So what I said, kind of your success factor might be that some of the people work inside universities that are incredibly skillful and incredibly brilliant, that when they close their eyes and they think about their future and their career, they're not thinking about working for Petrobras, right? They start dreaming about something else, like at the end of the day, because we need to have this type of disruption in the society where basically new ventures are created, that eventually either become maybe a collaborator with Petrobras. So I'm not using Petrobras here as a specific example, but this thing about an economy like the Brazilian economy, like my own company also in Denmark and in, like, say, South Korea, where a lot of the economy is driven by these big companies, which is a good thing, but it also hampers a little bit the whole innovative sort of a country at the end of the day. If you, when you dream about working for Samsung at the end of the day. So what we really see is that we're trying to spur a particular type of companies and a particular type of change that has to do with where we see these innovative IDEs, innovative disruptive companies coming from. And this is just a picture from, God, the picture on the left-hand side doesn't look like a fun place to work at, by the way. But I think there was a particular way of thinking about how a lot of these companies were driven back in the day. There was also the Xerox Park, the laboratories and stuff like that. There was this whole classic way of looking at where innovation would come from. Think about, okay, we have these big research parks. And for outcomes of these big research parks are these new companies at the end of the day. But there might be other places where the new ideas come from, and those ideas that actually at the end of the day create that type of new economy and new solutions for a whole region, for a whole city at the end of the day. So basically, this is another way to look at it. So we obviously need to center, this is still a program inside a university, so we need to sort of say that we say that we have a research foundation for what we do. And most of the things that we're really working on is with each team that goes through this is basically this type of triangle where we say that there's, for most countries, when I say region here, a region can be Rio. I'm from Denmark. There's more people in this town. You know, there's twice as many people in this town as there is in the whole of Denmark, right? So when we had Denmark going through, it was actually only a part of Denmark. Rio was going through the program. Sometimes it's a whole country going through the country. So when I say region here, and for the rest of the session, think country, think sometimes a city. That's sort of like vaguely defined about who actually goes through the program. But we always look at the foundational institutions as we start by analyzing the foundational institutions of any region or a country, for example. When we worked with Egypt, it is hard to have a country focus on entrepreneurship when one of the foundational institutions is a law that if you go bankrupt, you will go to jail. It's pretty tough, right? So sometimes when we work with a country, you say, well, this is all good, right? You can work on your university policies. You can have more postdoc become entrepreneurs. You can do all these type of things. But there are some fundamental things in your foundational institutions that you need to start by changing. I fundamentally believe that you have everything in place, but you need to optimize it fundamentally. You have a place in Rio and in Brazil that actually works quite well at the end of the day. A little less so, I would say, in Egypt, for example, where you can still go to jail if you go bankrupt. It is hard to take the risk to become a startup if you know that you go to jail if you fail. Who then wants to be, take the risk of being a startup? No one. That's the answer. Let me just see it. So basically, I just want to go back here before I go to ICAP and ECAP, because ICAP and ECAP is fundamental for the way that we teach the program. And ICAP is innovative capacity. ECAP is entrepreneurial capacity. And the best way to sort of talk about these, and I'm not going to go through these slides sort of like in very great detail, but the fundamental way to think about this is that many countries, as you look at them, are hoping to get some kind of balance between innovative capacity, and entrepreneurial capacity. We ask each region to do an enormous amount of analysis. It's a very data-driven program, but we also always have an assumption of where they're going to end. And I'll ask you a little bit, like, where do you think Brazil is in a way, or in general on this? But innovative capacity is the fundamental way that you are the way that you were able to bring knowledge about, right? How you produce knowledge that might be commercialized. That's the innovative capacity. We look at that at universities, it's R&D, it's about researchers. We also have medical centers, but the ability to develop new to the world innovations from inception through to the market. At the market, but not growing at the market. E-capacity is then to the ability to start new businesses at the end of the day, okay? So a good way to understand the difference between the two is to use the example of Lebanon versus South Korea. Lebanon has an incredibly high entrepreneurial capacity. An enormous amount of entrepreneurial sort of business creation is happening every day. The foundation of that business creation, of that ECAP, is a very low ICAP. Because a lot of the companies that are being created do not come from a strength within the university. There's no patent, which means that you really cannot protect it on the market. At the end of the day, is no comparative advantage. Whereas if you take the opposite, for example, is South Korea, where you have a very high ICAP, but you do not have a lot of business creation at the end of the day, comparatively, because they all dream about, I'm exaggerating the point, but most of the people then dream about working for Samsung. Right? So you don't have this like, oh, I have this idea, I want to become an entrepreneur at the end of the day. So that's a basic way to understand it. Most countries that are quite thriving and have an innovation ecosystem have some kind of a balance between the two. And the whole point is, as you analyze this, is then to figure out what to do most of. Many countries, what they normally do, regardless of political flavor, is to focus an enormous amount actually on the innovative side, the I capacity. Like, let's make sure that we have more more research. Let's make sure that we have more grants. Let's fund the universities even better. But if you don't fund the entrepreneurial side of this, make it easier to leave the university, for example, to become an entrepreneur without leaving your career behind, potentially as a researcher, for example, you will always keep having a high ICAP, but a very low ECAP at the end of the day. So what we help them with is really to understand how these work together and what to push and what to make some of the changes that you need to do so. Yeah, that's what I just talked about. Let's just take another one here. Yeah, these are just basically numbers. Maybe we can share the slides afterwards. So there's a world where we can do that. I think these are fundamentally just fun to look at in terms of where some of these countries are represented. These are the ways that we really go into sort of the analysis of ICAP and ECAP. Looking at fundamentally human capital, the funding, the infrastructure, the demand, and the culture and incentives. One of the key issues that we see over and over again in most places is that they're not very good at incentivizing the demand side, for example. There is a theory to say that if you structure your country in a good way in terms of ICAP and ECAP, companies will grow. What we see over and over again is that you need to have large corporations and you need the state to be a very sophisticated buyer. Just to give you one very concrete example on this, and I'm going a little bit on a tangent here, I know, but Travis, I will come back. Like, most of the technologies that you have in those phones are the fundamental result not only of research done by the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency in the US, DARPA, so basically defense research, but because the Department of Defense is an incredible buyer of prototyping at the end of the day. So they were able to basically sort of pull a lot of these early stage technologies towards the market at a time where they were very, very expensive to get there. We have small drones today, we have GPS, we have the internet, not only because of the development of the Department of Defense in the US, but because of the Department of Defense through something called the Other Transaction Authority, was able to act as an early stage buyer. So one of the key lessons that we always give to regions is that if you want to build ICAP and ECAP and successful companies at the end of the day, is that how good are you in being a buyer? Because those that buy are the ones that win. Those that are able to buy very early on and take those type of risks is going to be very, very successful. And when we get into the deep tech area, it becomes even more important because some of the prototypes, very early stage prototypes of some of these solutions in fusion system, molten salt, wherever you're working on, is sometimes millions and millions of dollars even to buy and test a prototype. That is very, very hard and a completely different type of company than doing a SaaS company, basically, where you can much easier get to the market. So that's where that demand side becomes very, very important. And so we work a lot with regions to basically redesign their public procurement and the way that large corporations can start actually buying from some of these startups at the end of the day. So basically, let me just go to the, let me just see. So this one is interesting because we talk a lot about comparative advantage. And I think there is, I want to use the one on the phosphate hackathon here, because to me, it's a story about how we work with comparative advantage for each region, but also the way that we sometimes work with regions that having a hard time figuring out what their comparative advantage is, and sometimes it's just right in front of them. They just don't appreciate it. Because sometimes the way that you are is that you do not see what you have, you see everything that everyone else has, and you want the same thing. That's why regions across the world, everyone wants to be some Silicon something. And most of the regions that fail to become Silicon Valley are the ones that start by saying, we want a Silicon something, by the way, because you did not start appreciating what you actually have yourself. So the phosphate hackathon there is kind of interesting because it's from Morocco. When we started working in Morocco, I did not know Morocco at all. What's the comparative advantage of that country at the end of the day? And they had many, many ideas about what to do and how to really get Morocco to thrive, until one put their hand up and said, what if we moved, because we're the world's second largest phosphate producer, how about we do something about that? How about we actually honing in on exactly that? And that was kind of interesting because for half of their own team from Morocco was not aware that they were one of the largest producers of phosphate in the whole world. And by moving that up the ladder of the value chain, they were able maybe to change fundamentally their economy. So one of the key results that they're now working on is a phosphate hackathon that basically year after year is working on new type of companies within that area to move them up sort of the whole value chain. So sometimes, the obvious comparative advantage lies right in front of you, but you need to start appreciating it in a different way. I think it's fair to say that the comparative advantage of Rio is something to do with energy, right? And that is clearly here. That is in a way self-evident. The key part for the question for Rio is to say, so if we are to do something with that and change that fundamentally, how does that look like? What are the current programs and policies that we need to change? What are the current power structures that we actually need to change to really get to a different place? Let me just go to, I think I want to hand it over to you because I want to leave time for some questions. So I want to hand it over to you, Emily, on the whole deep tech piece and the engine, because I think Travis, we can go on and on here on the reprogram, and that's fine. But I think we would like to give you a little bit of an introduction to the reprogram and how we work with regions. And then I think instead of us just talking here, it would be great just to get some questions from you guys and how you see it. And we wanted to give you an introduction to the reprogram and how we work. I think you have a gist of that right now, how we pull through regions from across the world to figure out who they are, what's their comparative advantages, and basically focus on that. One of the key issues that we really focused on for some years now is what we call deep tech, and how that works and how you need specialized structures to really support that in a good way. And one of those very particular structures is called the engine. And then we're happy to have you here, Emily, as the CEO of exactly that to give an introduction to that. So is it okay I hand it over to you, and then
will you go back a couple of slides?
I can go back a couple of slides. Why don't you take this and then
Yeah,
you can
I'll go
that.
back. Here, I'm going to use this piece. Um,
my name is Emily Knight. I am the CEO of The Engine. We are an accelerator and an incubator for what we call tough tech. We are, I would say, a really interesting sort of niche ecosystem inside of Kendall Square that you just saw. The idea was from the president of MIT, the previous president, who looked around all of the laboratories and said that there is incredible technology being developed, but it is not finding a market. And that was, think of fusion and quantum, and BioBot was up there. That's wastewater epidemiology. These were really interesting technologies. So lots and lots of IP, lots and lots of ICAP at MIT, but it wasn't finding a market. And when it was leaving the lab and they were translating out, it was all being pulled to the West Coast, to Silicon Valley. And so this was a moment for MIT to harness and sort of retain that ICAP and also an incredible amount of ECAP in the Boston, Massachusetts ecosystem, but maybe not the technologists. They were not necessarily getting the entrepreneurship training. And so how could we, with all of the ECAP in the Boston area, really start to harness this new idea of deep tech and tough tech? We call it tough tech because we say that this is a novel technology that is solving the world's toughest challenges. We've mapped those to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and don't tell the companies what tough tech is. We sort of let them tell us, my technology is solving this challenge or this challenge. A really interesting model, there is not at MIT, but there's a technology that was developed just down the street at Tufts University out of a silk lab. And so this one technology, this really interesting silk, has two applications. One company was spun out and coats food. So this silk protein is able to coat food and extend the shelf life anywhere between 7 and 14 days. Another application, a different company, is what looks like a Band-Aid patch made out of the silk with little micro needles that can house a vaccine and keep it shelf stable. And so someone could mail you a vaccine that you put on your arm and it dissolves into your skin as the silk protein is natural. And so really interesting where the technology was developed, but there wasn't enough sort of time or market polls for these technologists to think, what is the application? So they're solving different, really tough problems for the world, didn't have the what we would call patient resources to get to market. And so maybe a corporate was licensing that technology for a very different use. But the sort of goal of bringing these technologists on this journey to be the entrepreneurs and the leaders of these companies and to drive their technology and follow it out of the lab was part of this ecosystem that we wanted to build. So there was a great deal of venture capital in and around Boston and Cambridge and in Massachusetts, but no one was really interested in taking this type of risk. It's very long to market, even undefined. I would say the joke constantly in fusion is that it's always 30 years away. I don't think typical venture capitalists are interested in being a part of that joke. And so the original model was capital. What is the type of risk capital that can go along this journey? Not just the general partners who have to have this vision, but who are the limited partners who are going to go along this vision as well and really take this long approach. Capital network, who are the other people around? And so what are the foundational institutions? Who are the government leaders in Massachusetts who are going to help us think about setting up the first fusion plant? How do you site that? Where can that be? What is the regulatory around that? And so really bringing people along this journey and thinking about all of the things we're going to need. BioBot is a great example. When their first application was for the opioid crisis. And so they were testing wastewater I think it was originally in North Carolina. When COVID hit, they very quickly signed contracts inside of Massachusetts to start testing all of the water. And so most of us, when we wanted to figure out where it was spiking and what was going on, you could go to their website and they were testing all of the wastewater inside of Boston and Massachusetts. And so that was a government contract, but you had to have people with buy-in to understand and to do it with speed. This could not take a long time. So whether it's siting a permit plant and getting, siting a fusion plant and getting the permit, or signing a contract to do wastewater testing, this had to be done with speed. And so it was creating all of the buy-in from the different stakeholders, whether it was the risk capitalists, people who would really lean into this, the government leaders who we really needed to come along this journey and understand what it would mean, not just to help these companies move faster, but the implications then for economic development and the jobs that they would create. I think academia was another piece that we were really interested in, engaging folks who maybe typically were not interested in tech translation. They either didn't understand it, they were early in their careers and thought it may hurt getting tenure or maybe a distraction. And so really leaning in and engaging with the groups at MIT and across the different universities in the Boston area. So it was very important for us to start to pull the people in, we would say the technologists and the proto-founders, start to pull them closer to entrepreneurship, understand what that process would look like, and in some ways de-risk the process and de-risk them as the future leaders. So we specifically believed that we did not have to go out and find professional CEOs to be hired in. We really wanted to develop these young leaders and with their faculty co-founders, bring them along that journey. And so we actually run programs for people that are still probably a little less than 2 years from graduating to start to think about what it looks like. If they are interested in commercializing, if they're starting to think about market applications, we want to help them go through that process so that when they are ready, they understand what it looks like and can go faster. A lot of this is about speed. And so the engine was really meant to be a catalyst for this new type of technology. We didn't define it. We didn't say at the outset what it was or who it was for, but built a platform so that we could start to gather all of the stakeholders. And the 5-star model is what we use quite regularly. I think we sort of, if we could make it a 3D model, the entrepreneurs would be in the center. And a lot of what we do is try to fill the gaps that both the founders and their technologies are going to have. There are far more than one valley of death. There are many. And so our goal is to really put them at the center and to bring all of the other stakeholders along and help them on that journey. In the meantime, while we've been doing this, so if we're an engine and we've been around for just about 8 years, the National Science Foundation created a program called the Regional Innovation Engine Program, based on some of the research or a lot of the research from the MIT REAP program and a few of the professors. So we applied as an engine to help the other engines think about how to develop their regional innovation ecosystems. And it is a lot of this same work. REAP is doing work with the developmental version of the engines, and we have a cohort of 9 across the United States. Each of them has I think they could have actually benefited from going through REAP before they started, but the National Science Foundation wanted to, with speed, start to create regions across the country. And we saw this as a way to build a national tough tech network and scaffolding across the country for when a company maybe grows out of our incubator and is going to move somewhere else. We'll know where to send them. We'll understand where there's the right infrastructure, where there's workforce development programming happening. So these 9 engines all had to think, what are we really good at? What is the thing that we have here that is special? And what do we need to attract? There's 2 of them in one state. It's not a very big state, North Carolina. And 2 of them who are doing very different things, but a really interesting model to compare the 2 sides. There is a research triangle and medical schools, and the engine is called the regenerative medicine. So there are 3 medical schools and colleges. A ton of IP is coming out of there, lots and lots of research, but nobody's really interested in the spillover of commercialization. So they're holding on to it for a very long time. They're writing a lot of papers, but nobody's really ready to have it leave the university. And so they know they have the IP, they know that they have use-inspired research, but they need to create an engine for entrepreneurship. And they needed to figure out how to get that out there because they also have industry. There are corporates, so they can start to work with them. They can start to collaborate. So we were able to bring them programming to advise on sort of that pull that we've been able to do. We've done a lot of work with their technology licensing officer. Are you bringing me a chair? Really thinking about what they have, what are their strengths, what do they want to be a magnet for, and then really thinking about jobs. How are they going to not just bring the technology out, but create jobs for the future out of these startups? I'm going to sit. The second engine, it gets very confusing because we're all called engines. The second engine in North Carolina is a really interesting one based on legacy industry. So the second engine is around the circular textile economy. There is a lot of really old manufacturing, and I think about 60% of the clothing and textile manufacturing happens in this region. It's a much more rural region of North Carolina. So they have an aging population who knows how to use all of the equipment. So they're thinking about workforce development, who's going to take that over. And they would like to be a hub for this circular textile economy, but they don't have the technology. So they don't have the ICAP, they don't have the ECAP, but they have the industry. And so what they are trying to do with the infrastructure is to become test beds and pilots for all of the technology around the world who have the ability to do that, and they can test it there. So small startups who need to have pilots. It just so happens in our facility, we have an incredible company that went through our blueprint program. It was a MIT Sloan student and a chemical engineering student. They came together, they formed a company called Macrocycle, and they are able to, with both plastic and textiles, recycle the materials with 80% less energy used. So really interesting technology, but they need customers. And so we were able to plug them into this circular textile engine, and they are now able to test. And so they have the facilities that they wouldn't have had. They have customer buy-in, and they have all of this material that they can use. And so that region is really thinking about bringing industry to them, bringing the ICAP and the ECAP, and so that they can use the assets they have to become a center of excellence. They don't have to be doing all the research, but if they are where startups go, then the research will actually follow them, and so will the dollars and the grants, and they will have a new industry, which will also create a new workforce and economic development. So two very different versions, but really the ideas and what we talk about with not the same exact language, but if you want to be a magnet, you have to first think of like, what are you trying to attract? What do you have? What is your magnetic power? And what are you trying to attract towards you? And so that assessment of what makes up your region, what are your strengths? Because if you just say we want to be the Silicon Valley, it's not going to work unless you actually know what you do well and what you want to be. And so we deeply care about tough tech. I think the idea there is that we can be a platform for all of these different companies, and we can use all of the work going on inside of MIT and the other incredible institutions in Massachusetts, and we can help draw that out with all of these other stakeholders we've gathered to help them. And as we support these regional engines, regional innovation engines across the United States, there's 9 today, and there may be another 10 in a couple months. We really think about both the REAP model and this idea of what is their specialty and what do they need to attract with their magnet.
Okay. Perfect. I think we'll pause there. I know this was kind of a lot of information, but we wanted to take some time to see if you have any questions.
Okay, it makes it easier here to pass the microphone. My question is if you can explain a little bit, maybe give some example of the RIP process, the process itself, times, and deliverables of this process, and so.
Yeah, of course, I can do that. So the program is designed, it's like an accelerator for a region instead of for a startup, right? So it's designed to be time bound and it's cohort based. And so when we accept regions, we accept up to 8 of them. And those 5 stakeholders that we showed earlier, we need to have fairly senior representatives from each one of them entering into that cohort representing the region that they are from. Across the 2 years, there's 4 workshops. Three of the workshops are at MIT, and one of them is in one of the regions in the cohort, so that we can kind of show off another innovation ecosystem besides Boston. Um, it's across 2 years, but everybody keeps their day job. We say it's probably 3 to 5% of someone's time, because the workshops are about 3 to 4 days each. And then you have about 6 months in between those workshops for your task force to go home and implement what you stood up in front of the classroom, the MIT faculty, your peers from other countries, and said you were going to do in those next 6 months to try to keep that accountability and that momentum going through the 2 years. Once you hit about the second half of the program, you're done with that analysis phase. You've developed a strategy, and now you're starting to implement it. And so those teams will usually create new policies and programs that are very right fit or designed for the challenges that exist in that particular ecosystem.
Sorry. Is there a follow-up for the implementation? Because you said the teams go, come back, they doing the implementation, or do you assist in the implementation? Or?
Yeah, we do, and that's a good question. So we call them action learning cycles, where there's like a workshop and then 6 months to work on it, and there's 4 of those till you get to the end of the program. And towards the kind of fourth quarter of the program, each region will create what we call a backbone organization. They design and create it for their region. It really gives the governance, financing structure for those initiatives to live beyond the end of our engagement with them. We don't want these initiatives to kind of just be nice experiments. We want them to actually make a long-lasting, real-world impact.
So what I can maybe sort of add to that is what you're experiencing here was one of the outcomes of the Rio team, right? So we always asked them to define, basically what we call programs and policies. You mentioned that. So this belongs under what we call a program. So something that you do is time bound. This will probably last many years, but it's not going to last maybe 30 years, right? Whereas you have policies which could be, related to IP law. It could be related to, we just worked with some countries in Africa, putting in for the first time even a law around entrepreneurship, these type of things, which is, a one-time thing that happens, but it's going to last normally for a very long time. So each and every one of those regions comes out with something very concretely that we want them to work on, and they need to basically, based on the analysis, and they're a must-win battle, as we like, what does winning look like? Like, what are the key things that you need really to do and to work on? Because most regions, because there's all these stakeholders, always come up with a laundry list, right? There's always too many things you need to do. And if you have a significant amount of people that are working political institutions, you'll have an even longer list of things to do, right? That's just the way it is. So we always ask them to, like, what are the key things that you really need to focus on to actually move the needle in a particular area? And one of the things that came up when we were working with Rio was how do we get a whole new community around the energy transition that goes beyond the classic stakeholders, all the brand names in Rio, and really get them to meet in one place. And this is the outcome of that. You have also seen now a venture capital fund coming out from Petrobras that they've started together with BNDES and FINEP. Was also some of the ideas that were discussed during that, saying we need to use our capability as a large corporate to start investing into things that, we would either work with or maybe even, threaten us in terms of their product at the end of the day. And that's okay at the end of the day, because we know that we sometimes use this jokingly, the metaphor, like even the Marine needs the pirate ship, right? Even some of those that are, the ones that really are at power and is really an economic driver, needs to have these other types of companies. So very concrete outcomes that comes out of that, and inspired by, I think, a truly global cohort. When the Danish team went through the whole program, I think one of the key value points, because I was on that team, was to speak to people from that were outside, even outside Europe, right, that are doing things just fundamentally different.
Brazil is about to invest around $600 million in developing research and innovation centers over the next years. So, in terms of partnership with institutions like MIT, what would be research lines that would be interesting for you guys and could make sense for us as well in terms of digital transformation or energy development?
I think my first thought is like that sounds very interesting. I'd like to hear more, because I think some of those areas might be sort of like always given a label, like where they need to focus. But I think you need to build on, if this is about research collaborations, I think you need to build on existing strengths. That's how it works, but it could also be other things, I guess.
You are supposed to, the government is investing in the creation of research, development, and innovation centers. They should host around 50 researchers, and you need to operate them for at least 3 years. So there are some lines of investments, but what I was looking for to get back from you, what would be, subjects of interest that we could try to work together?
I think, first of all, there might be some subject matters, right, in terms of, like, let's call it actual research, like things that are done there that could be of benefit. But it might also be interesting then to ask the question, like, if you were to move beyond R&D, is there another objective? Is there a commercialization objective? Are there all these type of things that is there? Then I think maybe that's also a way to collaborate on these matters as well. So then, the ECAP. Just to use our own language, like if you only work on the ICAP, basically we will be doing a lot of great research, but so what, right? At the end of the day, and I assume because this is public capital, it comes with an expectation of an outcome, right? And I think that's probably also where we can help then to execute on that within that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, this is Flavia from BIP Consulting. And when I think about Rio to become a technological city, innovative city, I feel some skeptical feeling about it, to being very honest. So I'd like to hear from you, what are the main risks and opportunities? You mentioned some of the advantages of Rio to become this kind of city, but what are the main risks?
I can start. So it's going to be very idiosyncratic, right? At the end of the day. But I think one of the key things that the Rio team, when they went through this, and they were quite honest about this, is that you live in a city and a country that is, let me say it in this way, heavily influenced by very big public companies. So there is an existing risk on how you actually balance a future where you basically keep this because they're incredibly important for the economy, but at the same time that they institute a different type of change, even for the green transition, for example, at the end of the day. So they need to be an integral part of that sort of development. But at the end of the day, the way that I probably best can say this is that this city sometimes, I think its heroes are the people that are from the large corporations, and it's not seen through the lens of the entrepreneur as being the hero. Because if the entrepreneur was the hero, things would be done in a different way. Things would not be as slow. Things would not be as bureaucratic at the end of the day, if you actually wanted to create more entrepreneurs at the end of the day. So I think that's probably the main risk that I see. Is a very idiosyncratic viewpoint. I admit that, but I still see that there needs to be. I think you still need to find the right model. So how to work with the large corporations, because they matter and they're great. but how they can work by actually creating entrepreneurship that is outside them. So I jokingly again with the metaphor, how to get the Marine to create pirate ships, right? At the end of the day, I think that's probably and what we've been working on, by the way, with them. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say another thing is so our organization is an incubator and we have a very hard time finding a way to profitability. We call it public infrastructure, the necessary thing for the health of an ecosystem, but also very hard to fund. So I'd say a risk would be that you think you just throw a little bit of money at entrepreneurs and that it's easy and it'll happen. And so the risk is there's not enough investment in sort of that core infrastructure needed to support really early stage, what we call tough tech, who need not just a garage or a coffee shop with internet, they need a lot of core infrastructure. Some of that infrastructure is actually inside those large corporations. So it requires people to be very creative and open their doors and say, oh, we have capacity on these machines. We have extra lab space. Could we allow a startup to work here? And then I'd say the other thing is you're going to have to be patient. We think that tough tech takes a long time. We have been at this for 8 years. And we still haven't had an exit, and that is totally fine. Again, it's like I hope fusion doesn't take 30 years, but we need to invest in it anyway for the energy transition. So I think the other risk is that, if like in 5 to 7 years there isn't something big and sexy, that it's abandoned.
And I think at the end of the day also, and I think this is the recommendation I give to all of our teams, is that if you fundamentally need to change the system and you cannot change it from within because you do not have the time, then you need to find the people that don't, will not work with the system, but basically just do it anyway, right? So if you can't get your large corporations to open up their doors for their equipment for advanced experimentation, because as you do so, you're met with you need to sign this clause on background IP or foreground IP and I do not whatnot. What you then hope for is that someone says, that's an opportunity for me to do something fundamentally different. And I think what is important is that you then rally the support for those that are the heretics, right? Those that actually think fundamentally differently, not from within the system, but start appreciating those that work from outside the system and have those crazy ideas at the end of the day and say, I want to do something different. Because if you need this type of access, right, the engine was created also in a way because it was sort of like it was spoken about inside MIT, but it was also, I think, fair to say that it was also an acknowledgement that you would not change fundamentally MIT from the inside. It needed to be outside, right? So I think that's also just another way to think about this. So sometimes you need to maybe ask yourself, and do I have enough friends that are pirates? Right? Or am I fundamentally always acknowledging and giving, appreciation to those that are, within the current system? And I think mostly about my own network and the way that I earn money by being within the existing system. And am I paying attention enough to those that actually fundamentally wants to change that? Because normally in any context, in any cultural context, when you start appreciating those that are outside the system, that doesn't, say the hero is XYZ that everyone agrees upon, that's risky. It's a cultural risk even. But, so maybe that's one good thing. Like, find a pirate friend at the end of the day, because that might be an entrepreneur. And every entrepreneur needs someone who says, I want you to be an entrepreneur, and I appreciate you at the end of the day. And that at least we can do.
For Emily, just a question. I'm not too familiar with the whole process of development of these tough techs, but I have a question. Do you have, in your experience, have you seen, gains in between before the exit, I would call micro exits, or meaning, IPs that are developed along the way of the developer, for instance, of fusion, that can help fund the whole project somehow? This, or maybe even business that can come out of that, the whole process, years of development. Does that happen?
Um, I think I understand the question. Around
For
business
instance,
model
what,
sustainability.
yeah, one example, in fusion, for instance, there has been huge developments on lasers.
Yeah.
Maybe you can make money out of this development of laser, and then that can help funding the whole process
Yes.
of
So there have been.
development of fusion.
Yeah, I think it's actually what's been really interesting is it's not just the one company and one thing that they can do with Commonwealth Fusion Systems. They had a HTS tape that was something really integral and specific to their development. That tape was developed in the Plasma Science and Fusion Center at MIT and has other applications. So there's a really interesting model where they need the tape to make their magnets high throughput, but they also could create a supply chain and sell that to other technologies that need that same superconducting material. So there are a lot of sort of, as the companies are developing and creating IP along the way, they usually then have a library of new things they're discovering on that, that can be spin-outs, they can be separate companies, they can be revenue streams. So yes, that happens quite a bit. I think there's also with new specific to energy, it's not just going to be fusion and this one type. I think same with geothermal. What we're interested in and what we see the sort of like young technologists coming through our programs, they're developing all of these technologies that will be the supply chain for geothermal and for fusion. There's a really interesting, really young entrepreneur who just graduated from our Blueprint program who is using AI to rapidly characterize superconducting materials. And so that has applications across many, many different technologies. And he can sell in or be acquired to by one of these other companies. So there is constant IP developed, and what these companies choose to do with it and their resources is just a matter of stage, if that answers your question.
Does that have some impact, real impact on the business?
I mean, their valuation, yes. I think if they're constantly looking at different markets and applications, yes. It would depend in the moment on their fundraising and what they're trying to do. Most of them are pretty laser focused on their go-to-market, and so have to think in the moment about and what it means to create a new business line and how that helps.
Yeah, because that could be distractions also.
Could be a huge distraction, yes.
I think my experience, I think Commonwealth Fusion System is one example. It's also a very extreme example in many ways. I think some of the examples I see from venture capital investments into deep tech, at least in Europe, which I know mostly about, is that you're able to set very specific technological milestones that, if achieved, radically de-risks the whole process and can lead to separate business lines. And that is what most often is what I'm seeing in an investment memo is basically a very clear focus on these exact things at the end of the day. And some of those achievements can then be separate products as you see it. We have some companies, even in Denmark, where you actually see that one invention has led to several companies. So it has this like a spread out effect to it. But yeah, from a venture capital perspective, I think the key part of these deep tech investments is the ability to have clear guidance on the technological risk is probably where I see, at least at the earliest stages. Because basically for most of the deep tech, you do not have, as you have in drug development, you do not have clear, milestones that are set. You do not have specialized investors into all of those phases, right? So until we get there, because we're actually learning this again, right? We are reindustrializing in many of these areas. So we don't have specialized VCs that you have in drug development, for example. It's sometimes a comparison I think is okay to use.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think, is there one more? Or? Okay.
Right. What I would like to hear from you is how can you bring more capital for our agenda? And for example, we have some researchers showing that deep tech investment are giving more return than traditional techs. The last European deep tech report show it, and but it's not enough money, and the public funding has a limited funding, but venture capital we don't have enough. Also, um, philanthropy, family offices, alternative capital. How can you, if you can share some ideas to bring money to this agenda, will be very nice.
Well, I'm going to say the obvious thing is to look at your levy funds, right? Start using them in a different way. And I know that there is a regulatory sandbox that is being set up. I think it's an obvious piece to do and to look into that specifically. So let's imagine that you were able to use a big portion of that money as to fund creation, so to be part of equity investments. You should probably do that in a way where they have a catalytic effect in getting the private capital in from across the world and also from this country, in terms of that could be from rich individuals, it could be for family offices, it could be from wherever. So I think that's one way to use them. If they were used without a catalytic effect to drive into private capital, I would be afraid that they would have too much of a political steer at the end of the day, and to really focus on new technologies that could be beneficial. But I think you have a huge opportunity there. I also understand that you're working on it, that this is something that is there, and I think that is one way forward, at least. There's probably many ways to do this, but I think that is one of the more promising ways.
Perfect. Well, we are out of time now, so I just want to thank everybody for coming, and we'll hang here for a few minutes if you have any extra questions. Thanks.